Welcome everybody to New Heart, New World. I'm Rasika Manjari and thank you so much for joining me today. Today we're going to discuss head meets heart, or the mysteries of the mind. Now, it's long been known that our thoughts and feelings are intimately connected. However, as we may have heard, the longest journey can be from the head to the heart. Modern psychology is very varied in its approaches to how it deals with this connection, the journey from the head to the heart, and all the complications and difficulties that may lay along the way. And one of the main modalities that's used today in modern day psychology has a very cognitive approach, and it's actually termed cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognition refers to the processes of the mind, and so this implies that the mind is some kind of an epicenter or driving force behind the emotional outcomes that we experience. So that journey from the head to the heart is often driven by our cognitions as per the theories of psychology today. So this powerhouse or epicenter that the mind is actually is a way of as a potential tool that we can harness and change the way we express our emotions and ultimately our behaviors, which cognitive behavioral therapy is all about. Also, modern neuropsychiatry is the study of the brain and the neurons and neurotransmitters and synapses that create our thought processes that ultimately influence our emotions either negatively or positively. So even modern day neuroscience actually tells us that that connection between the mind and the emotions is there. And not only that, it is subject to change. So it can be changed. So thoughts and patterns of behavior that stem from thoughts and resulting emotions can actually be transformed through various processes, which we'll go through in a moment. So there are three key aspects to this theory that neuropsychiatry presents, and that is one of plasticity. The first one is that of plasticity, where the mind is actually known to be subject to transformation and change. So previously it has to be understood that the synapses in the brain and the neurons were thought to be fixed, and that once damaged they could never be repaired and never resume their normal function, let alone improve or be enhanced. So modern day neuropsychiatry tells us that the brain is plastic, that it can be changed and that it can be modified. So this is a very important understanding for us. And along with that comes the concept that it can be rewired in terms of the synapses and neurotransmitters that it connects to, the neurons connect to. So that rewiring results in a kind of reprogramming, which can ultimately influence outcomes through emotions and behaviors. And then of course we go even beyond that, to beyond the experiences of the day-to-day, beyond the experience of the regular senses, which takes us to the realm of quantum physics. Now, all of this in a way, in perhaps a slightly different way, but having a similar resulting concept, is taught in the Bhakti Yoga philosophy, culture and practice. So these teachings that the Bhakti Yoga philosophy tells us around the fact that we can change, our minds can be trained to achieve positive outcomes in terms of our deep-seated emotional experiences, are only echoed in modern day psychology and neuropsychiatry. So we understand from this that changing our thoughts, our thought patterns, and hence our behaviors and resulting emotional experiences is ultimately possible. So we aren't hemmed into what we believe we are or how we think we are destined to be eternally in these bodies. We don't necessarily have to be limited by that thinking, which in itself can be changed. So the sages of the ancient Eastern Bhakti Yoga tradition knew at a very fundamental level that the mind can be trained and that it can be modified and changed to benefit us and to become our best friend rather than our worst enemy. Now, they also knew that when the mind is our worst enemy, it can work against us. It can actually be actively trying to limit our progress and our growth and hence our evolution as a spirit soul. So when it's our worst enemy, we experience things such as mental illness of various forms, and a common one is depression in our society today. But then, of course, our mind can be our best friend when it's catered to in the way that it needs and when it's expressing itself in its truest essence of the modality of goodness and support for who we truly want to be on our journeys as human beings, reaching for the ultimate spiritual destination of liberation from these bodies ultimately altogether. So these very same sages gave us detailed instructions on how to achieve this, and these instructions are found in the Bhakti Yoga teachings and through subsequent videos, and also already discussed in previous videos, we've explored, or we're going to explore a little bit more about these teachings and how they can assist us in our daily lives. Now, the mind is a very strange thing, and it's strange in the sense that it's a wayward entity. It's wayward in that it rarely does what it's told in the moment. However, through training and through establishment of healthy patterns, it can be reined in and trained to be beneficial to us, as we just spoke of. Even the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says that the mind, well, actually Arjuna says to Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita that the mind is harder to control than the wind. And indeed it is. However, there is a way. There is a way to control the mind, and Bhakti Yoga has the answers. So our thoughts influence our emotions, and our emotions influence our thoughts. And there's this constant toing and froing and sort of interconnectedness between the two. And modern psychology and science tells us, even the modern psychology and science tell us that when we harness our mind, through the practices of cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever other modality is used, that we can achieve positive emotional outcomes in the short and long term. Now, these modalities can be helpful, and sometimes they work, but often they require repeated effort and continuous exposure to their principles and practices. Of course, like with anything, it requires practice and perseverance. Now, Bhakti Yoga offers this package in a way that is very, very pleasing to the soul, to the spirit, because it is a package ultimately of love. And we'll come to that more in a moment. Because we may ask, okay, well, if we're told that, if we do the right thing and train our mind, then we can have a positive emotional outcome and be happy ever after. Well, it begs the question, how can this be done? And we mentioned that there are psychological approaches which may work in the short term and even in the long term when effort is applied. However, ultimately, it doesn't address the true bottom line, which is that we need soul food. We need food for the soul, and simply catering to the mind and the senses and the emotions doesn't necessarily address the whole picture. And we often notice that there is that constant struggle between the head and the heart. So we may know, for example, what is good for us, or that if we engage in a certain behavior that it's going to be beneficial for us in the short and long term. We may know all of this. However, assimilating it and integrating it at the level of the consciousness, the heart, the soul, and really appreciating that what we do is going to be beneficial for us, and actually enacting it and making it a part of our daily routine, that is where the challenge lies, and which is not fully addressed by modern psychology and the theories of modern day neuropsychiatry and neuroscience. So to understand this struggle between the head and the heart, it's important to understand the subtle body. Now, in previous videos, we've already spoken about, through the lens of the Bhakti Yoga philosophy and teachings, that we are spirit souls. As individuals, we're spirit souls in material bodies, having a material experience. And as we go from body to body, life to life, we also take part of our material essence with us that actually keeps us connected to the material realm. So that would be the subtle body. So while we have a gross body, which is these bodies that we find ourselves in, then we also have, as part of that material body, of which the gross body is a part, the other part of that material body is the subtle body. So the subtle body is something that we can't see, not like the material body which we can see in the mirror. The subtle body is invisible to the naked eye, and it comprises of three things: the mind, the intelligence, and the false ego. So the mind, of which the basic building block is a thought, has the main function of the mind in the Bhakti Yoga teachings is to accept or reject that which is offered to it by the senses, the five senses that we experience in our day-to-day lives. So it accepts or rejects it, and it decides what is positive or negative and beneficial or not beneficial to us from a moment-to-moment basis by the information that it receives through the senses. And what happens is the mind, to simplify its job, it likes to create patterns and it likes to make things easier for itself by establishing certain ways of deciding what's beneficial and what's not beneficial, and these become entrenched and become sort of a programming that that often sticks with us for often years and lifetimes even. So this is what we're aiming to change when we address it through, as we mentioned, through the what modern psychology tries to address in today's societal experiences of mental illness, and also through the Bhakti Yoga teachings and practice, whereby we use the concepts of the Bhakti Yoga teachings to inform the mind, and hence result in a change in what it accepts and rejects through the information of the senses. So we've spoken a little bit about the mind now. Now the second part of the subtle body is that of the intelligence. Now the intelligence informs the mind, so it's the intel. It actually gives the mind the information it needs to help it make its decisions of accepting and rejecting what it receives through the information from the senses. So the intelligence is fundamental in shaping the behavior of the mind and hence bringing it under control. And so intelligence comes in the form of things such as values and beliefs and structures that we live by. So it helps to remember this sort of a flow chart, if you like, where our beliefs and values inform our thoughts, which is a function of the mind, which then result in words and actions on our part, which become habits. And then, of course, our character develops from that, which informs who we are in terms of our nature. And that ultimately creates our destiny. So I'll just go through that again. Our beliefs and values lead to our thoughts, which lead to our words and actions, which lead to our habits, which lead to our character, which leads to our nature, which leads to our ultimate destiny. And that can be over lifetimes. So you can see from this flow chart that when we align ourselves with, with helpful, constructive beliefs and values, that is, our intelligence is that of an elevated form of understanding and knowledge, then of course we are definitely on our way to creating for ourselves a very positive and wonderful destiny in this life and also in lifetimes to come. So then, of course, the remaining component of the subtle body is the false ego. Now, as it implies, this is a false concept. So the ego implies our identity, and the false ego is that which we think we are, but we actually are not. So this refers to our material identity, so the gross body and the subtle body together. So when we identify with this too strongly, then we actually call this the false identity, the false ego. And that is what we're trying to shake. That's what we're trying to dissolve so that we can expose and reveal our true identities as spirit souls. Because when we do that, we're much better able to operate out of a place of goodness and engage in activities and thoughts and behaviors that influence us for the better and enable us to evolve as spiritual beings. So in essence, our mind is a result of our programming. And because of this, because it can be programmed in the first place, because it's subject to patterns and repetitive conditioning, then it can be reprogrammed. So that's really important to remember, that reprogramming, which is akin to the plasticity that we mentioned of neuropsychiatry. And so this subtle body is actually our conditioning. So it's what ties us to the material plane. It's what we carry with us from life to life. So when the gross body dies and is no longer in existence, what remains in terms of the material aspect of our being is the subtle body. And that subtle body, comprised of the mind, the intelligence, and the false ego, is carried over from life to life to life. So how we look after the subtle body influences our destiny, influences our experiences thereafter. So the mind, as a master of our senses, once programmed, controls the experience of those senses, what it chooses the senses to be exposed to or not exposed to, and what it decides is best for the self through the avenue of the senses. And so it creates those patterns that we spoke of, because that makes it much simpler to operate from moment to moment when it understands that there are certain things that that it prefers and that it doesn't prefer through the modality of the senses. So when we understand the nature, firstly, it's important to know what to expose the mind to, because when we expose the mind through the senses to positive sensory experience and uplifting sensory gratification, then it's actually going to influence the mind in these patterns that it loves to establish. And this is where the habitual patterns of the past can be changed. It's at this point that it can be changed and that the mind can be reprogrammed for the better. So when we expose the mind to certain sensory experiences, what happens is that these form deep impressions in the mind, and this is why it's so important what we expose ourselves to in terms of our senses, because these deep impressions create deep emotional experiences which can be carried from lifetime to lifetime, and these are called samskaras in Sanskrit. So when we understand the nature of the subtle body, it's much easier to understand the place of Bhakti Yoga in all of this, because there is an inroad there through all of this material essence, through our gross body and our subtle body. There is an inroad there that Bhakti Yoga can penetrate to break down these structures and to ultimately dissolve the false ego so that our true spiritual identities are revealed. So Bhakti Yoga comes in at the level of the intelligence. So it forms the intelligence. It's actually the way in which we're informed through the philosophy, the practice, the culture of Bhakti Yoga, because when this intelligence informs the mind, then the mind knows better what to accept, what to reject through the modality of the senses. So when we're saturated at both ends, or when our mind is saturated at both ends, through the input of the senses and the input of the intelligence, then it can be trained into the beneficiary and good friend that it was meant to be. So in that way, we can utilize our mind for our benefit and not let it go astray and wreak havoc, which it has a tendency to do if left unchecked. So when we understand these principles and concepts of Bhakti Yoga, it's much easier to adopt the principles therein to modify our mind and its patterns that it so loves to create. And ultimately, Bhakti Yoga recognizes that we are beings of love, and Bhakti Yoga is the science and the yoga of love. And in previous videos, we've already become familiar with the sacred Mahamantra, which is an incredible tool which can inform the intelligence and the mind and ultimately connect us to that true identity that we are as spirit souls, and break down those illusions of the false ego and refine our senses to the point where we only accept that which is going to be ultimately beneficial to us, that is going to ultimately uplift us and lead us to our spiritual evolution and enlightenment. So perhaps we can chant the Mahamantra together now. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that one who has conquered, for one who has conquered the mind, the super soul has already been reached, because he or she has achieved tranquility. Now, wouldn't we all like a dose of that, tranquility? So I'll leave you to consider that and to perhaps think about how you may integrate the principles and practice of Bhakti Yoga into your life to help train your mind and uplift you to the highest level of divine love. If you would like to find out more about any of this, please visit my website at newheart-newworld.com. And if you like the content of this video, please press like, and if you'd like to share it with your friends as well, that would be much appreciated, so that more people can avail themselves of this kind of knowledge. And of course, if you'd like to know when the next video is going to be available, please subscribe, and you'll receive a notification for the next video. So until then, I wish you all well. Bye for now.